March 2020. Ohio. Arthur stands at the pharmacy counter holding a white paper bag that should contain 30 tablets. It's empty, and he turns it over once, as if the pills might fall out if he waits long enough. They don't. Behind the counter, the pharmacist avoids eye contact. Not rude, just careful. Shipment didn't come in. Arthur doesn't argue. He's 68, retired, a former electrician who followed every routine checkups, stable dosage, automatic refills he could predict down to the exact week each month. He knows missing a few days is not supposed to matter, and he also knows that eventually it does. The belief is simple. If you live in a developed country, your medication exists inside a protected system, regulated factories, national stockpiles, controlled distribution that feels stable and redundant. That's what people think they're paying for. Arthur folds the empty bag and puts it in his jacket pocket, telling himself maybe it's just this location and the next one will have it. He doesn't go home right away and instead sits in his car with the engine off, the receipt still on the passenger seat. $12, $40.30. The same price as last month, which makes the moment harder to process because nothing about the cost suggests anything has changed. The number stayed the same, but the medication disappeared. Here's the part no one explains. The pill was never really here in the way people imagine it, even if it feels local and controlled. It was finished here, counted, and labeled for distribution, but not truly made here where the system appears stable. The chemical that keeps Arthur's blood pressure steady likely traveled thousands of miles through a fragile chain most people never see. That concentration sounds like efficiency when everything is working, like the system has been optimized to remove waste and reduce cost. In reality, it is compression. And compression behaves perfectly right up until something pushes back against it. 3 days later, Arthur tries again at a different pharmacy, expecting a small delay rather than a systemic problem. He hears the same answer, delivered with the same careful tone, back-ordered, with no timeline, no estimate, and no reassurance attached. He asks a question most people never think to ask because they assume the system is still intact. How many others? The pharmacist pauses, then lowers her voice and answers in a way that changes the scale of the problem. More than you think. This is usually where people realize the shortage didn't begin at the shelf, even though that is where they first experience it. It began weeks earlier inside procurement systems, shipping schedules, and production decisions that quietly failed before any patient was aware. By the time Arthur hears out of stock, he isn't early, he's already late to the outcome. And here's the contradiction that should make you uncomfortable. The cheaper your medication is, the more fragile its supply chain becomes, because low prices create the appearance of access while removing the margin that keeps supply resilient. Arthur's prescription is generic, affordable, and widely used, exactly the kind of drug that should be impossible to run out of in a functioning system. Except those are the first to break, not the rare treatments or experimental drugs people assume are more vulnerable. The basics fail first: blood pressure medications, antibiotic precursors, the daily stabilizers that millions quietly depend on without thinking about where they come from. 1 week without it, and nothing feels different on the surface, which is what makes the situation deceptive. Arthur tells himself he feels fine, but one morning, he stands up too fast and has to steady himself against the kitchen counter before the dizziness passes. Second week, and he starts cutting his remaining pills in half. Not because a doctor advised it, but because the numbers no longer work. 30 tablets became 15 decisions, each one stretching time instead of solving the problem. Third week, and a replacement is offered with a different manufacturer and a slightly different formulation. Equivalent, they say, and the word carries more uncertainty than comfort because it assumes stability in a system that is already failing. 2 days later, Arthur is in the emergency room with dizziness, a pressure spike, and an irregular rhythm that forces immediate intervention. He is under fluorescent lights with a paper bracelet tightening around his wrist, a visible marker that the system failure has now become biological. He did everything right and still ended up here, which is a part no one prepares for. And this is where the story turns, because Arthur's problem isn't medical in origin even though it ends that way. His body didn't fail first, the system did, and he only felt it when the consequences reached him. 2 questions should be sitting with you now. Even if you've never missed a refill or thought about where your medication comes from, how can something this essential depend on so few places? And why does the failure only become visible when it is already too late to react? Because if the break started before Arthur reached the counter, then people standing in line right now still believe they are waiting on a delay. They are not, and they are standing at the end of a system that already broke. 1621. Band Islands. A Dutch ship sits just offshore, the air thick with the sweet smell of nutmeg drying in the sun. A man named Pieter stands on the beach holding a ledger and a musket, checking the numbers before he finally looks up at the trees in front of him. Behind him are orders that leave no room for interpretation: control the source or destroy it. The public story of trade is cooperation, where countries produce what they're good at and exchange fairly so everyone benefits over time. That's the belief most people still carry. The forensic record is sharper because when a resource becomes essential, trade turns into leverage, and leverage doesn't negotiate so much as it quietly dictates terms. The Dutch East India Company didn't just buy nutmeg to meet demand in Europe. They eliminated competition by burning trees on islands they didn't control and removing the people who cultivated them, sometimes by force and sometimes by something worse. This wasn't expansion for its own sake. It was about pricing power anchored to scarcity. Back in Ohio, Arthur sits at his kitchen table with a prescription bottle that feels lighter every time he picks it up, turning it slowly in his hand as if the origin might be printed somewhere on the label. It isn't there because the most important part, the origin of the active ingredient, was never meant to be visible to him. Here is the hidden rule that connects these two worlds centuries apart and built on entirely different technologies. If you control the origin of a necessary compound, you don't just influence price, you control continuity, and continuity is what people actually depend on. Today, no one is burning pharmaceutical factories in public view, and there are no ships anchored offshore enforcing compliance. There are no muskets, just contracts, but the outcome can look disturbingly similar when production concentrates into a handful of facilities. In 2018, a single manufacturing plant in China responsible for a key blood pressure medication ingredient was shut down after regulators found contamination during inspection. One factory was enough, and within months, entire batches were recalled across multiple countries, leaving pharmacies with nothing to dispense. Arthur doesn't hear about factories, inspections, or contamination reports that triggered the shortage weeks earlier. He hears something simpler and more reassuring on the surface: we can offer you an alternative, which sounds like continuity even when it isn't. The reality is more precise and less comforting once you look past the phrasing. When one node fails in a compressed system, everything downstream adjusts to absorb the shock. But patients don't experience adjustment. They experience substitution, delay, or absence. Here's the contradiction most people miss until they are inside it. Globalization was supposed to diversify risk, but in pharmaceuticals, it concentrated it. Because once generic prices collapsed margins, production collapsed inward to wherever it could survive cheapest. 3 become 2, and 2 become one facility for a specific compound that millions quietly depend on without ever seeing it. No one notices this compression while the pills keep arriving, because continuity hides the structure that makes it fragile. Arthur stands at his sink, cutting another pill in half with a kitchen knife that wasn't designed for precision. Watching the edges crumble slightly as he brushes the powder into his palm, he tells himself 10 days is enough if he stretches it carefully, even though the math has already started to tighten. Meanwhile, somewhere thousands of miles away, a procurement manager is reviewing a spreadsheet filled with supplier contracts, cost per unit columns, and a deadline that doesn't move. They are not thinking about Arthur as a person. They are thinking about which supplier can still deliver at scale under pressure. If one supplier fails, they move to the next viable option that meets cost and volume constraints, not the one that provides the most redundancy. The system doesn't reward resilience in that moment. It rewards continuity at the lowest possible cost. That is the second hidden cost most people never see while the system appears to function normally. It does not optimize for your stability as a patient. It optimizes for its own survival under financial pressure, and those priorities diverge when something breaks. The Banda Islands were small, remote, and easy to ignore until you understood what they controlled in global trade. Modern pharmaceutical hubs are larger and more complex, but the principle hasn't changed, because control over origin still shapes outcomes far beyond its location. Arthur opens his cabinet and looks at what remains inside the prescription bottle, counting quietly without writing anything down. 7 halves, 3 full tablets, and roughly 10 days if he continues cutting them carefully and hopes nothing else changes. This is where the shift becomes harder to ignore, even if he hasn't said it out loud yet. Shortage is not just a supply problem. It is a timing problem, because the system can absorb disruption before it becomes visible. By the time it shows up at the pharmacy counter, the disruption has already moved through production, shipping, and allocation decisions that no patient ever sees. Which means when you notice it, you are not early enough to adjust, you are already inside the gap. There are 2 questions expanding now, whether you have faced this personally or not. If one factory can ripple across continents, how many medications depend on a single point like that? And what happens when more than one of those points fails at the same time? Some people still believe shortages are temporary delays that resolve once logistics catch up, like a shipment running late or a backlog clearing. They are not delays in the way people imagine. They are the downstream effect of decisions made far away long before the shelf went empty. Arthur closes the cabinet slowly, holding the prescription bottle a little tighter than before, as if grip could compensate for uncertainty. It's not just medication anymore, it's time, and it is no longer predictable in the way he assumed it would be. Arthur wakes up earlier than usual, not because he needs to, but because something feels slightly off. Not pain, not yet. Just a faint pressure behind the eyes, the kind you can ignore if you want to believe everything is still under control. He reaches for the prescription bottle on the counter, unscrews it, and pauses before pouring anything into his hand. 3 full tablets left, 7 halves. The math hasn't improved overnight. What people imagine is a shortage caused by disruption, an unexpected event, a temporary breakdown, something abnormal. A factory shuts down. A shipment gets delayed. A problem that will be fixed. That explanation feels contained. The system was already fragile before anything went wrong. That's the part that's harder to accept. Because the modern generic drug market runs on margins so thin that even small cost increases labor, regulation, transport can make production unviable, not unprofitable. Impossible to justify continuing. Arthur takes half a pill with a glass of water and stands there for a moment, waiting for the familiar sense of routine to settle in. It doesn't. He checks the bottle again, as if recounting might produce a different number, then places it back in the same spot on the counter where it has sat for years. Same object, different meaning. Here is the mechanism underneath everything you're seeing. Generic medications are intentionally cheap, often costing less than $10 for a monthly supply, because competition drives prices down to the lowest possible level. That sounds like access. It is until it removes the buffer that keeps supply alive. When margins disappear, manufacturers don't maintain excess capacity. They don't build backup facilities. They don't stockpile ingredients beyond what is immediately needed, because none of that is rewarded in the pricing structure. So production concentrates, not as a conspiracy, as a consequence. A single factory becomes responsible for a disproportionate share of global supply for a specific compound, sometimes 40%, sometimes more, and when that factory slows down, fails inspection, or shifts production to a more profitable drug, the system doesn't bend, it gaps. Arthur sits at his kitchen table with a notepad, writing down dates and pill counts like he's solving a problem that can still be managed with enough attention. 10 days becomes 9, 9 becomes 8, he circles the number 7, then stops writing. There is no column for after that. In 2019, the FDA reported that over 60% of drug shortages were linked directly to manufacturing or quality issues, not demand spikes, not panic buying, production failures. The system breaking exactly where it was most compressed. Here's the contradiction that should be uncomfortable. The drugs that keep millions of people stable every day are treated as low-value products inside the system that produces them, because they are off-patent, because they are cheap, because they are expected to always be there. Arthur receives a call from the pharmacy. They found a limited supply from a different distributor, but it's a higher price and not fully covered. $86.70 for the same medication that cost $12.40 a month ago. He doesn't argue, he just asks them to hold it. Low price created the illusion of security. It also ensured that when disruption came, there would be no cushion, no redundancy, no incentive for anyone to absorb the shock. This is where the system reveals its real priority. Continuity is not guaranteed, it is conditional. And the condition is cost. Some manufacturers have already exited certain generic markets entirely because the economics no longer make sense. That leaves fewer producers, which increases dependency, which increases fragility. Arthur opens his wallet and looks at the receipt from last month, then at the new quoted price written on a small piece of paper. $12.48, 70, same drug, different reality. He does the calculation without saying it out loud. If this continues, it's not just a supply problem, it's a budget problem. And then it becomes a decision, medication or something else. This is where shortages stop being abstract and start becoming personal trade-offs. A grocery cart with fewer items, a delayed utility payment, a skipped appointment, one bottle, one decision. And here is the part most people don't see until they are inside it. The system doesn't fail all at once. It fails unevenly. First in supply, then in price, then in access. By the time it reaches the third stage, the language changes. It's no longer out of stock. It becomes not covered, not available, or not recommended. Different words, same outcome. Arthur places the prescription bottle back on the counter, but this time he doesn't let go of it right away. He holds it for a few seconds longer than usual, as if weighing it. Not the pills, the time. And the question shifts again. Not whether the system will fix itself, but whether he can last long enough for it to matter. Arthur stands at the pharmacy counter again, this time holding his wallet open before anyone asks him to. There's a new number written on a sticky note next to the register. $86.70. Same drug, same dosage, different supplier. He nods before the pharmacist finishes explaining, because at this point, the decision isn't medical anymore, it's financial. This is where the system reveals something most people never see from the outside. Shortages don't distribute evenly, and they don't arrive all at once. They cascade. Hospitals get priority first, because they are considered critical infrastructure and operate under contracts designed to preserve continuity. Then large pharmacy chains with long-term supplier agreements that give them preferential access. Then everyone else, independent pharmacies, rural areas, and patients paying out of pocket. Arthur is not at the front of that line, and he never was even when the system appeared stable. In 2021, more than 90% of generic prescriptions in the United States depended on foreign manufacturing for their core ingredients. Not the finished pills people see, but the components that make them function in the first place. Arthur taps his debit card against the terminal, hesitates for a second when the total appears, then presses confirm because there isn't really a choice. Transaction approved, $86.70, and he already knows this won't be the last time he sees a number like that. Here is a hidden cost that follows the shortage once supply tightens across the system. Pricing power shifts, and it does not move toward the patient who depends on the medication. A distributor with remaining stock can raise prices without losing demand. A manufacturer with limited capacity can prioritize higher-margin drugs over essential generics. An insurer can reclassify coverage tiers overnight, quietly shifting more cost onto the patient. Arthur walks out with a small white bag again, but this time it feels heavier in a way that has nothing to do with weight. Not relief, but pressure that follows him out into the parking lot. This is the part people misunderstand because it feels temporary while it's happening. They assume shortages resolve once supply catches up, but pricing changes often outlast the shortage itself. In 2017, a saline bag shortage caused by hurricane damage in Puerto Rico pushed prices up more than 300% in some hospital systems. The storm passed, production resumed, but prices never fully returned to where they were before. Arthur sits in his car and looks at the receipt, folding it once, then again, before placing it in the glove compartment instead of throwing it away. He knows he will need to remember this number later, even if he doesn't say why out loud. Here's the perspective shift most people never consider when they think of themselves as patients. You are not just receiving care. You are a demand signal moving through a system that reacts to pressure. When supply is stable, your demand is routine and predictable, something the system can absorb without strain. When supply tightens, your demand becomes pressure, and pressure is managed rather than satisfied. That means someone decides where limited supply goes, even if that decision is never visible to you. Not publicly, not transparently, but systematically through contracts, priorities, and constraints. Arthur's prescription bottle sits on the passenger seat as he drives home, the label facing up and the count inside temporarily restored. 30 tablets again, the same count as before, but produced inside a system that is no longer behaving the same way. It looks like normality if you only look at the surface, and that is what makes it easy to accept in the moment. But it is not the same system that produced last month's bottle, and it will not behave the same way next month. Here is the uncomfortable reality that becomes visible once you step inside the pattern. Shortages reveal hierarchy, and not everyone loses access at the same time or in the same way. Some lose quietly and early without alternatives, adjusting before anyone else notices there is a problem. Others don't feel it until much later, when options are already limited and prices have already moved. And there is a reason for that pattern, even if it is never explained directly. Systems under stress protect the nodes that sustain the system itself, not the individuals moving through it. Hospitals must stay operational, large contracts must be honored, and supply chains must maintain flow where they generate the most revenue. Everyone else adjusts around that reality, whether they realize it or not. Arthur places the new bottle next to the old one on the kitchen counter, lining them up without thinking. Old price, new price, same label. He stares at them for a moment longer than necessary, then turns away without saying anything to anyone else in the house. Dinner is simpler tonight, and he doesn't mention why. This is how the cost spreads through ordinary life, not all at once, but across small decisions that add up. A smaller grocery cart, a delayed repair, a bill paid later than usual because something else came first. One prescription becomes multiple trade-offs, each one quiet enough to ignore on its own. Together, they reshape what normal life looks like. And this is where the situation shifts from uncomfortable to dangerous in a way that isn't immediately visible. When access depends on price, and price depends on scarcity, stability becomes something you have to afford. Arthur sits at the table with the bottle in front of him, not opening it right away because the meaning has changed. For the first time, he is not just managing his condition, he is managing the system around it. And that system has already shown him something he can't unsee, even if he hasn't said it out loud yet. It does not fail equally, and it does not fail randomly. It fails in order, and he is starting to see where he stands. The question is no longer whether supply returns, because that is outside his control now. It's where you are in that order when it doesn't, and whether you recognize it before the next break reaches you. Arthur stands in his kitchen holding the prescription bottle, but this time he doesn't open it. He sets it down next to the receipt he brought in from the glove compartment, flattening it on the table like something that needs to be studied. $86, 70/30 tablets. 30 days if nothing else breaks, and he already knows that assumption no longer holds. This is where most people look for a solution inside the same system that just failed them. A different pharmacy, a different insurer, a different version of the same dependency. That instinct makes sense. It's also the trap, because the system is not designed to guarantee or continuity in the way people assume. It manages supply under constraint, and your outcome depends on timing, position, and how much disruption you can absorb. Arthur pulls out a second bottle from the back of the cabinet, older and nearly expired, something he doesn't remember buying but knows he's glad he kept. He turns it in his hand, checks the date twice, and does a quiet calculation, realizing he doesn't remember needing to think this way before. Not how long it lasts, but how much margin it gives him. Here is the shift that separates people who adapt from people who get trapped inside the same failure pattern. They stop assuming access and start measuring exposure in days instead of prescriptions. Most people know exactly how much money is in their bank account at any given time. Very few know how many days of medical continuity they actually have if the system stops delivering. 7 days, 30 days, 90. For many, the number is smaller than they expect. Arthur lines up both bottles on the table, counting silently, then writing it down this time. 43 days, if nothing else changes, and he stretches carefully, and he underlines the number once before looking at it again. It doesn't feel like enough. This is the hidden cost that doesn't show up on any receipt or insurance statement. Dependency without buffer, where stability exists only as long as supply continues uninterrupted. In 2022, the average pharmacy carried less than 30 days of inventory for many generic medications. Not because of negligence, but because of how the system is structured. Inventory is cost. Cost is minimized. Safety is not stored, which means the system you rely on is not storing your safety in any meaningful way. It is passing it through, just in time, with no obligation to hold more than necessary. Arthur opens the fridge, not because he's hungry, but because his thinking has shifted into a different category. Health, not treatment. He looks at what's inside processed food, leftovers, convenience, then closes it, and stands there for a second without taking anything. Here is the contradiction most people resist, because it feels like a personal failure instead of a structural one. The more dependent you are on a continuous external supply for basic stability, the more fragile your position becomes inside a system that requires uninterrupted flow. And uninterrupted flow is exactly what breaks first when pressure enters the system. Arthur sits down and writes 2 columns on a piece of paper, drawing a line carefully as if clarity depends on precision. Must have. Nice to have. The prescription goes into the first column and everything else starts shifting around it. This is where the problem becomes personal in a different way, because it is no longer just about access. It is about priority under constraint. When systems compress, you are forced to make decisions the system used to make for you, often without realizing it was doing it in the first place. What matters first? What can be delayed? And what cannot fail under any circumstances? Arthur circles the medication, then looks at the grocery receipt again, noticing fewer items this week for the same total. He doesn't need to calculate it precisely. He can feel the difference. This is the second survival layer most people overlook until they are forced into it, reducing dependency where possible, not eliminating it, but shrinking the surface area exposed to failure. For some, that means addressing underlying conditions that can be influenced over time. framed not as lifestyle improvement but as risk reduction under constraint. For others, it means something more immediate and less comfortable to confront. Buffer. Arthur writes a number at the bottom of the page. 365 days, and he writes it anyway even though he isn't sure how he would get there. This is where the system quietly changes perspective without announcing it. From patient to planner, from consumer to custodian of something that used to feel guaranteed. And here is the uncomfortable truth that sits underneath that shift. No one tells you to do this because the system assumes it will continue functioning as designed. But the forensic record shows something else entirely. Systems like this don't announce failure in advance. They reveal it through gaps that appear too late to react to comfortably. Arthur picks up the prescription bottle again, but this time it feels different in his hand. Not just something to use, but something to manage carefully over time. And the question shifts one more time, becoming quieter but more urgent. Not just how long it lasts, but what happens when it doesn't, because he knows the warning will come too late. Arthur is back at the same kitchen table, the prescription bottle in front of him, the receipt still folded beside it. Nothing about the scene looks dramatic. Same house, same routine, same objects. But the meaning has changed. The system didn't collapse. It adjusted. That's the part most people misunderstand. There was no announcement, no clear moment where access officially ended, just small shifts. Availability became uncertainty, price became a filter, continuity became conditional. And that is why it is so difficult to fix, because nothing appears broken at the surface level. Pharmacies are still open. Shelves are not empty all at once. The system still functions, just not for everyone, and not in the same way. What survives in systems like this is not fairness. It's priority, it's positioning, it's whoever can absorb the disruption long enough to outlast it. Arthur looks at the bottle, then at the paper where he wrote 365 days. He doesn't cross it out, but he doesn't assume it either. This is the final contradiction. You can follow every rule, do everything right, and still find yourself negotiating for something that used to be automatic. What matters now is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. Not predictions, not timing. Exposure. How dependent you are. How much buffer you have. How quickly you can adapt when the system stops behaving the way it used to. Because the people who get trapped are not careless. They are consistent. They trust continuity. They assume the system will keep doing what it has always done. The people who adapt see something different. They don't assume access. They plan for interruption. They treat stability as temporary. Arthur picks up the receipt one last time and smooths it out on the table. $86.70. The same number is printed clearly unchanged. But it no longer means what it used to. The account was full. The money was there. The system still processed the payment. And yet, what he actually bought was not certainty, just time. That is the difference most people miss until it is too late. Nominal access versus usable stability. Arthur places the receipt back under the bottle, as if holding it in place. Not to organize it. To remember, because next time, there may not be a higher price. There may just be nothing. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Do not measure security by what the system promises. Measure it by what continues when the system is under pressure. And if you want a structured way to think through what you depend on, what breaks first, and how to build time before decisions get forced, that framework is waiting for you. The bottle is still on the table. The label is clear. The count is visible. For now, it looks full. But he knows something he didn't know before. That number is not the truth. It's just what's left.